the deadline for submitting abstracts has passed. We have many great abstracts that we're taking a look at, and I believe we have over 150 individual registrations. I believe that's right. So we have lots and lots of interest. So that's great, and it's also great to have you all here for this and hopefully the other talks in the series this term. Without further ado, then I will introduce our speaker, Professor Christof Schöch, who is Professor of Digital Humanities at the University of Trier. He is I guess within the Digital Humanities context, he is a text person. He's written extensively on authorship, attribution, text reuse and similarity across a wide range of genres, and made important theoretical contributions as well. Today, he's going to be speaking to us on a very important and timely topic in many ways. His talk is entitled Current Issues in Copyright and LLMs in Digital Humanities. Without further ado, then, I'll pass the virtual mic over to Professor Schöch. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Stuart, for the introduction and, of course, for the occasion to speak here. It's really great. It's a great opportunity to speak, and I'm really happy that we're doing this. I'm sorry that I can't be in Hong Kong in person, but I hope to come back to Hong Kong soon and maybe connect with some of you at the next occasion. I see even one familiar face. Hi, yes. Yes. Anyways, I will start right away and share my screen, and we'll see if that all looks okay. I need to just remove this element here, and I think that should be all right. If anything is problematic with the slides, just let me know. So yes. Current issues regarding copyright and LLMs in digital humanities. This is my topic today. I will speak a little bit about the context in a second. But yes, I do think that this is a timely topic because we are trying to move into using in copyright materials more and more. And we have a parallel development in a way where AI companies to train their large language models use a lot of in copyright materials as well, and that has sparked a lot of debate around copyright and LLMs more broadly.
Hi, sorry, Christof. Sorry to interrupt you.
Sure.
Certainly for me, the screen is still entirely black.
Oh, that's bad news. That shouldn't be the case. Just now when we tested it, it was great. So
yeah, I was testing it. Sorry.
No problem. Let me just stop the sharing once more and try that again. Okay. Yes. We'll just run with it, right?
Yeah, let's just roll. Let's roll.
Yeah. Okay. So current issues regarding copyright and LLMs in digital humanities. And by the way, we usually try to build in some technical difficulties that we resolve very quickly, just to make people who are not doing digital humanities feel comfortable with the digital humanities people who are expected to be these like technical wizards. But this time it was definitely overdone. So this was not intentional. Anyways, so you can follow along, by the way, the slides if you want at your own pace using the link that you see here. It's also shown at the bottom in smaller font size during the presentation. This is what I want to talk about. I will just briefly introduce the issue of copyright, digital humanities, and language models, raising some of the current problems we have with copyright law by explaining the current situation with European copyright law, especially the text and data mining exception, which has been very important, but does have some problems that we're trying to address, using the concept of derived text formats for in copyright texts. and I will explain this concept of derived text formats and go through three use cases that address the relationship between language models and derived text formats for in-copyright texts in three different perspectives. One, just using derived text formats for research, in this case for topic modeling. Then in one case, using derived text formats for fine-tuning large language models. And third, the question of reconstructing derived text formats, so reconstructing the full text from derived text formats using LLMs. So a potential threat to that model of derived text formats coming from LLMs. Before I conclude, just 2 or 3 disclaimers. First of all, I'm not an expert in copyright law. I have taught alongside an expert in copyright law multiple times. We have a regular recurring class on copyright and the digital humanities here in our DH master's program. But still, I'm by no means an expert. When I say copyright law, what I usually mean is EU copyright law. If I speak about other jurisdictions, I would explicitly say so. For example, the whole fair use doctrine in the US. When I say AI, I mostly mean large language models, but it's better to speak directly of large language models anyways. And final point, I want to give a special thanks to Dr. Kelly Du, who worked with me on most of the research that I'm presenting today. So let's dive into the topic with this, more general view on the big issues in general AI and copyright law as they present themselves at the moment. And if you just look at the press, there's a lot going on regarding copyright. There are case trackers, so people listing all the currently ongoing copyright cases that involve AI companies. There are timelines, and you see already here the names of basically all the big companies, or a bunch of big companies in this in the AI game: OpenAI, Microsoft, Anthropic, Google, NVIDIA, Perplexity, Intel, and others. There's a number of open cases at the moment at different, various stages of the court proceedings. One of them involves OpenAI and could potentially involve really damaging penalty payments, even to a company like OpenAI. Just very recently, we had the Anthropic copyright settlement. So a case where the company basically decided that continuing the litigation was too risky and that they preferred to settle for $1.5 billion US, so a really significant amount, but they were basically worried that this might get even more expensive. These are interesting cases as well because they basically, well, this particular case is interesting as well because it basically, the judge argued that training large language models was covered by fair use. So because it is a transformative activity, it is covered by the fair use exception in a way. But that the fact that the company knowingly used in copyright materials from pirate sites such as LibGen or Anna's Archive, that part of their activities was illegal, and these are the books that are now subject to penalty payments. This is obviously also changing the way that AI companies need to think about their business model. This might involve the need to pay for licenses in the future. There are also cases regarding licenses. There are already a lot of cases where media companies agreed on licensing terms with AI companies. The New York Times is an example in case, etc., and many more cases like that. I just linked a few of them down at the bottom as well. Now, in digital humanities, the situation is obviously a little bit different, but an interesting phenomenon is that we have a sort of a window of opportunity, you could call it, that goes from 1780 to 1920 for research, where research is easy, where materials are plenty, and for two reasons. One is OCR, so a technical reason. OCR is tricky for materials before, let's say, 1800, and the more you go into the past, the more difficult it gets. At some point, you move into handwritten text recognition territory, so materials are scarcer. Of course, technology is pushing those boundaries all the time, and so, you know, we're moving back in time, but largely speaking, it's still, you know, around 1800, maybe 1750 is where OCR gets much easier than before. The second external factor for this window of opportunity is copyright. And basically with, you know, copyright lasting 70 years after the death of the author, it means that, you know, works that have been published by authors who died in the 1950s are becoming free to be used, are falling into the public domain now. And so anything that is more recent than, you know, 1920s, 1930s, it depends a little bit, is problematic, whereas everything before is unproblematic. And that means that we have this window of opportunity where, you know, OCR is easy and copyright is not a problem yet, where we can have plenty of materials and can research on them, can share them, can accumulate resources. But of course, for purely non-research related reasons, right? OCR is a technical condition, copyright is a legal condition, and that is shaping the agenda of many people doing research in digital humanities. For example, just one example for this, there's a very useful looking corpus called Chapitre. It's a corpus of French novels that claims to cover the period 1800 to 2000 with 2000 novels. So large corpus, wonderful, looks great, but once you look into the metadata and you plot the publication years, the years of publications of those novels, you see that the bulk of this corpus, of the novels in this corpus, have been published between 1840 and 1920. And so there's very little for the first couple of decades of the 19th century, and there's very little for the, let's say, broadly the second half, a little bit more even than the second half of the 20th century. And this is exactly that window of opportunity that shows up here. I'm sure this was, you know, not a design choice in the sense that this is what they wanted, but this is simply what they got, what was possible. And so the background to this is, of course, copyright law. And this is where I want to go to now, before then talking about one solution to this issue. So European copyright law, and the focus will be on the text and data mining exception. But first of all, some basics of copyright law. This is probably you all know this, but basically copyright gives control over the creative works to the author of those creative works, and the copyright protection lasts for 70 years after the death of the author. And it wasn't always like that. It was 50 years before, then was extended to 70 years. So there's shifts, but they come very slowly, and there's no big change in this basic principle to be expected. And while this is not a universal principle, it is let's say the baseline in many, many jurisdictions around the world. This can lead to quite unexpected effects. For example, when we were building a corpus of novels for the period 1840 to 1920, thinking we are in that safe spot, safe period in this window of opportunity, we came across one particular novel that was published in 1884, and so seemed to be a safe bet for inclusion in the corpus, that we wanted to be public domain only so that we could openly share it. But it turned out this was an author who had written her first work very early and then went on to live very long and only died at the end of the 1950s. And so that novel from 1884 was still protected by copyright when we were building that corpus. So you really have to be careful, and this has you know, implications and influence on what we can do today. Now, from the perspective of the author, the copyright affords a number of things to the author. For example, the right to be associated with the work, so to be named as the author with the correct name, the name that they chose. They have the right to not be misrepresented through derivations of the work. For example, if you do a politically a parody of a work with a strong political bias, then you would be misrepresenting that author's work. So that is not allowed. The author has, of course, the right to control the reproduction of the work, and that's the key provision in our context, and to monetize that right, of course, for example, by granting paid or granting licenses to publishers basically against payment. From the perspective of the work, not everything is protected by copyright, but the work is a work, and as such can be protected if it has a perceivable form. It doesn't have to be printed. You can also, come up with a poem and recite the poem in a public space, and that poem would automatically be considered. You would be granted the copyright of that work. It has to be a personal creation, and that's also important in our context of copyright and large language models. Machines cannot acquire copyright. So anything the large language model generates is not automatically does not automatically receive copyright, and certainly the machine doesn't receive any copyright. Only people, only natural persons can own a copyright. The work has to, in that work, the individuality of the creator has to be discernible. So if the text or the work of art you're producing or the data you're producing doesn't leave any kind of room for decisions, for individual decisions, for expressions of your individuality, of your creativity, then it is not a work in that sense of copyright law. That's important as well in the context of, let's say, weather reports or coverage of sports events that simply say, okay, at minute 12, person X made a goal for team Y, and etc. And then the question of copyright infringement. What is a copyright infringement? So an infringement takes place basically as soon as the work is reproduced without consent from the author, even if that happens temporarily and privately. And this creates all kinds of problems, of course. It means that whenever we do research and we download something onto our hard drive, that's a reproduction already, and that's a copyright infringement already, even if there is no, even if it's not public. So strictly speaking, that is already a copyright infringement. But then, of course, there are sort of aggravating factors, things that make such an infringement more serious. For example, if third parties, due to that reproduction, third parties can consume or read the work. So if you make it publicly available and in a form where people can read it, that makes things worse. If the reproduction that you are making available replaces an existing commercial option, that of course makes things worse as well, because you're basically creating a competition to an existing commercial model or a business model. So these are certainly things to avoid if you want to do your research undisturbed. Now, this situation was clearly recognized as being problematic by the EU in around 2015. The EU recognized that copyright law was outdated, and for several reasons. One is that copyright law obviously had been designed long before the digital revolution and was simply not adapted to the digital world. In the past, copyright would be an issue that only concerned publishers. So people, companies with the means of physical reproduction, of printing, of producing records, of making copies of movies, things like that. But in the digital world, anybody can easily make reproductions of anything simply by calling up a website and downloading something, or even just calling it up, and you already have a reproduction in the working memory of your machine. And if you download it, you have a copy of it again. And of course, in the digital realm, making copies, making reproductions is super cheap, super easy, and spreading, so publishing and distributing them is also very easy, because we have all become prosumers, producers, and consumers at the same time. The second reason that the EU recognized copyright law was outdated was that in this under these conditions of digitality, the copyright law was not conducive of innovation, for example, through text and data mining or to all kinds of other statistical computational approaches of innovation, of efficiency, of sustainability, and they wanted to work on that. So in 2019, after a long process of discussion, a pretty wide-ranging revision of EU copyright law was agreed. At the time, the public debate around this was mostly concerned with the concept of upload filters. So, for example, YouTube would have to scan all the videos that are being uploaded to the platform before they are published, instead of, as it is done now and is still being done, there are post-upload checks and post-upload actions, but not pre-upload activities. So, and sort of under the cover of those debates around upload filters, the text and data mining exception was introduced. And I will talk about that in a second. And the way this works in the EU is, so the EU level law is the Directive on Copyright in the Digital Single Market. And you already see Digital Single Market. This is also about competitiveness. This is about innovation and efficiency within the EU. But the way this works is that these kinds of laws then have to be enacted as national laws in all the different European countries. And of course, this happens at different speeds with different, little details of difference, but supposedly it happens in the same way across the EU. Now, the key provision the key provision for digital humanities in any case, and for computer science, is the text and data mining exception. So basically, it means that it exempts some reproductions from the copyright restrictions if you are doing text and data mining. To say it very simply, and to say it a little bit more precisely, the text and data mining exemption allows you to create corpora from any kind of in-copyright works for text and data mining. There are some conditions, I will get there in a second, but basically you can create corpora data collections for text and data mining. You can make all kinds of necessary modifications and reproductions in the working memory, on the hard drive, etc. You are allowed to normalize the data, structure the data, classify any items in your data, annotate the data. So a lot of the activities that are necessary, cleaning the data, annotate metadata, doing linguistic annotation, all of that is allowed. And you're allowed to share the resulting corpora with team members, so those who work in your project on that data, and with, for example, peer reviewers for publications. But, and this is why I highlighted it, you are not allowed, obviously, to share the resulting corpora publicly, openly, for anybody to reuse. And this is the key limitation of the text and data mining exception that we're trying to address with the derived text formats, and I'll get there in a second. You're also allowed to archive the corpus for further research. And this is something that was added a little bit later, because before the archiving was very, very limited as well. Anyways, but there are some conditions. The goal has to be non-commercial academic research. So not anybody can do this and say, hey, I'm going to do text and data mining. There's a separate legal provision for commercial research, and it has more restrictions. But this, what I just explained, is like the key TDM exception for that is relevant to academic research, is the one that is only allowed for non-commercial academic research. And the second condition is that you need to have legal access to the source materials. So the case of Anthropic, where they are basically now penalized for having used illegal sources for texts, that would also apply under the text and data mining exception. On top, of course, of the problem that Anthropic is clearly a for-profit company. And on top of these conditions, there are also two limitations. One is that this legal access to the materials is required by the law, but it is not granted by the provision. So just because you want to do non-commercial academic text and data mining doesn't mean anything you can find is automatically legally accessed for you. The legal access has to be obtained independently of the text and data mining exception. And if there is any digital rights management protections on the materials, like, you can only use it in Adobe editions, or there's some other encryption or lock on it, you are not allowed to circumvent it. You're not allowed to break it. However, you have the right to obtain a DRM-free copy of the material from the publisher. This is, of course, a huge problem, because that means you have to, for every book that you bought that has DRM on it, you have to go to the publisher and ask them to provide you with an openly usable, copyable version of it. And that's something that obviously doesn't scale. The text and data mining exception was meant to enable scaling, so that you don't need to get a license from every publisher of every work and clarify in every single case, but just so that you can do this at the scale of masses of text, of large numbers of text. And so whenever there's DRM on it, this breaks down completely. So that's another problem. And just as a side note, interestingly, we tried this. We bought some DRM books from various publishers and asked them following, afterwards, said, hey, we are doing research on this. We're a university, we want to do text and data mining, please provide us with an open copy. And they all complied. So this provision seems to be known among the publishers. They didn't risk a court case or anything like that. They just complied. Anyways, so the text and data mining is really a huge step forward for research on in-copyright materials in the EU. So it's wonderful, but it has this limitation that we cannot share the corpora. And that means, you do all this structuring, corpus design, metadata, cleaning, annotation, and then nobody else can use it. Nobody else can look at it. So in terms of reproducibility, in terms of transparency of research, but also in terms of sustainability of research, that's a huge limitation. And this is where the derived text format comes in. So this is the derived text formats is sort of our attempt to provide a solution for this problem that we cannot share in copyright corpora openly even under the text and data mining exception. So with in-copyright materials, you have a number of options of how to do research. You could do this via an API, so where you authenticate, maybe against payment, and then you have an API personalized access to materials. You can download them, analyze them, and you signed a contract that you're not going to give them away. Or you could use access via some analytical platform where you again pay a fee. Then you can log into the platform, and on that platform there are all kinds of analytical tools that you can use on corpora that are also provided by the platform. So this is an option, but you can usually not design your own analytical algorithms. You cannot use your own the data of your choice, but you're limited to the data that is available on the platform. Some libraries also allow local full access to in-copyright materials in sort of closed room environments. So basically, and literally, it's a closed room. There's a room with a computer that has the data on it, and you're allowed to access that computer in that room. You can work there. You can do your own. You can run your own analysis on that data, but you're not allowed to take any of it out. So any USB key drives that you have in your pocket, you have to leave them. With the supervisor before you enter the room. So all of these options are interesting, but have their limitations. And so the fourth one, the derived text formats, also called extracted features, that's the solution of our choice in a way. And so what is it? The basic idea of derived text formats is that they are purposeful transformations of in-copyright full texts in a way that, on the one hand, they are useful for at least one method of text analysis, and on the other, they are devoid of any copyright relevant properties. So because not everything in a text is protected by copyright, there are certain elements that we can remove from a full text that makes the resulting text not protected by copyright anymore, but there may still be information in it that is useful for research. And that is the basic idea of derived text formats or extracted features. Now, this is not a new idea. We didn't come up with this idea, and I will say in a minute why I still what our contribution to this issue is. So there's, for example, a famous precursor, the HathiTrust extracted features dataset. You have probably heard about this. It features page level information on 17 million volumes. That's a lot of pages. It says here 6 billion pages. And you see on the right a little bit how that looks like. So basically for every page, you have a list, and this is a JSON format. You have a list of all the different words that have been found on that page with their part of speech. So there's linguistic annotation and with their frequency. So other here is marked as an adjective that occurs only once, and of is marked as in, not exactly sure what that is, and it occurs 18 times on that particular page. And then there's, of course, metadata, so you know where that page comes from, what is the page before, what is the page after, who's the author, etc. And you can do all kinds of calculations with that. Another precursor are the Cross-Asia Ngram, is the Cross-Asia Ngram service. Again, these are in copyright texts, at least some of them, or in copyright editions of those texts. That's another complication of the matter. And then the way this looks like is very simple. It's not annotated, but you see on the right, here you have trigrams. So this is one particular text with this little identifier up there, very small identifier, unique code that tells you, what text this is. And then you have the character trigrams with their frequency. And so they're not ordered. This is, you cannot read this, you cannot really understand it, but you still have those trigrams that may be interesting for a quantitative or linguistic analysis. So this is the basic idea, and what we are doing as our contribution to the German national research data infrastructure in terms of derived text formats is a couple of things. First, we have defined derived text formats as a technical and strategical concept. So, this definition we just read, and we basically put this on the agenda again, or in a more systematic way. We want to describe, and we have started to describe systematically multiple kinds of derived text formats. So instead of saying, oh, we do trigrams or we do JSON, we look at it and say, okay, what's the principle behind this? How can we describe this systematically and categorize different derived text formats that we find in the wild as being particular classes or kinds of DTFs? We are developing standardized and accredited pipelines that researchers can trust, so they know if I use this this derived text format, and it comes from the German National Library, and they tell me that they have used the standardized pipeline, I can trust that all the information that should be there is indeed in there, or that it has been prepared exactly in the way that it claims. And we are developing and implementing a research agenda on derived text formats, and this is the case studies that I'm going to talk about in a second are all part of that research agenda. Now, to produce a derived text format, we can look at three factors basically. The first one is, at what level of granularity are we operating? What is the target of the operations? Because producing a derived text format is always some sort of transformation, right? And so we could do this, for example, at the level of the tokens, so the individual characters or the individual words, or at the level of sentences. But let's stick with the token for the moment. Then there's a second element that is the question of in what frame do we look at this? Do we manipulate the token within the sentence or within the segment, like we just saw or the document? Like the Cross-Asia example is always the trigrams and their frequency in the document. Whereas in the HathiTrust, it's always the frequency of the individual tokens of the individual word forms in one page. So you have the token as the target size in a way, and then the reference frame, which can be a page or a document or a certain chunk of text. And then there are a couple of operations that you can apply. You can annotate tokens. For example, if we're at the token level, you can annotate tokens by adding the part of speech or the lemma or a word embedding vector or the named entity level or all kinds of things. The sentiment, a sentiment score. You can remove things. You can remove tokens. You can remove all of them or some information. You can replace, for example, the word form with the part of speech tag or the word form with the lemma or things like that. And you can randomize things. And again, the randomization is a really powerful tool, because randomization means in this case that you are removing the sequence information. So in a way, you're removing not the words, but just the order of the words. And that can be a very powerful mechanism as well. And this is also important. For this, it's also important, are you randomizing the order of the sentences or the order of the tokens? Are you doing it in the whole document, or are you doing it just page by page, for example, or segment by segment? So that's why the target, frame, and operation are key. So this is our way of trying to understand derived text formats, any derived text formats, and trying to describe it with these three at these three levels. Now, what's a good derived text format then? And basically, I think that there seems to be a trade-off, or it seems reasonable to assume that there's a basic trade-off between usefulness for research and copyright safety in a way. And so if you look at this graph here, or this little visualization, basically we start at the left where we don't remove any information. So we have the full text. It's super useful for research, but of course it's very problematic from the perspective of copyright safety. It's still under copyright, and if you share it, that's illegal, and you might be penalized. And then the more information you remove, the less useful the data probably gets for research, because in the extreme case, you remove everything, you just have the metadata and no text. It's not useful for research anymore, or at least it's, on the metadata level, you can still do something, but you can't say much about the text. Whereas from the copyright standpoint, it's of course perfectly safe because you're not sharing any text. There's no text anymore. So these two extremes tell us that something must be happening in between. And so what we're basically looking for when investigating the usefulness of a certain kind of derived text format for research is, where's that sweet spot where we are sufficiently safe from copyright, but the material is still useful. And you will see that there are different ways of looking at this. So just as an example, again, of some of these derived text formats. So here we have the first sentence of The Hound of the Baskervilles by Arthur Conan Doyle. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, who was usually very late in the mornings, save upon those not infrequent occasions when he was up all night, was seated at the breakfast table. And then, then the whole story starts. So if we just annotate this, we tokenize it and annotate this, you see here on the right, this is how it looks like. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, comma, who was usually very late, etc. Right? And then there's the lemma. So for example, for mornings, we have the lemma morning, so the base form, and we have the part of speech tag. So that's not a derived text format yet. That is just an annotated version of the text, right? But now we can add other operations. For example, if we randomize the order of the words, we do this at the level of the tokens. We use 1,000 word segments. So we don't randomize across the entire novel. We randomize within 1,000 word segments. Then we get something like this here. Sorry. Little drink. So you get the same words as in the previous slide, but in a completely different order. And so it's unreadable for humans, but it contains exactly the same tokens as the original, and it contains them in approximately the same position, because all the tokens that are in the first 1,000 word segment of the novel are still there, just not in the right order. And then the second segment, all the words are still there, just not in the exact correct order. So a lot of information is still there, even approximate position of the words, just not precise position of the words. And that's actually really important because that is a very useful format. And it all depends on this parameter here. How long are the segments? If you make the segments very small, you lose very little information, but you risk making reconstruction really easy because there are just not that many options. And if you make the window very large, you lose more information, but you gain safety from a copyright standpoint because the reconstructibility is basically very low. The second nice derived text format that is useful and that we really like is called selective replacement of tokens, where we again operate at the token level, and we do this across the whole document, but then we partially replace the word forms with the part of speech tag, for example, or with some other level of annotation that might be relevant. So in this example, you see that we have the same words again, the tokenization with the annotation, and the order is still preserved. So Mr. Holmes, who was very late in mornings, you see? So it's still the same text, but some of the tokens, for some of the tokens, the word form is missing and we only have the part of speech tag. So it's not you could guess what is going on. Hey, this must be, if this is a determiner, it must be you can sort of guess, but you can't really read it. And this means that, depending on how much you replace, it becomes more or less unreadable. The order of the tokens is still preserved. The part of speech frequencies are preserved. So if you're interested in that, this is still there. And part of the word forms are missing, but the other part is still there. So we still have a lot of information. Now, this is just to give you an idea of how these derived text formats specifically look like. And now let's look into the case studies of using them and seeing whether they are actually useful and how we can use them. So the first use case is topic modeling. It's a very popular method in digital humanities. It can be used for historical data, for literary data, for all kinds of data, for analyzing movies or comics or TV shows. And so this is a study that was actually done by a student in our master's program, supervised by me and a colleague from computational linguistics. And so he used 150 English language novels in the public domain so that this experiment would be, unproblematic from a copyright standpoint, but for testing, this is perfectly fine. He performed topic modeling with Mallet, which is the state-of-the-art, one state-of-the-art implementation of topic modeling. And then he used 4 different conditions for this. So he used the original full text. So we would expect the performance to be, standard and normal and best in this condition. Then he used a term document matrix where, you just have the word frequency per text across each novel. He used the randomized word order that I just showed with, with segments, and the partial replacement of part of speech, which I also just showed. And then for each condition, each of these 4 conditions, he ran 50 topic models, so the same process, but 50 times, and measured the coherence of the topics every time. And this allows him to basically look at the topic coherence distributions for each condition and compare them. And so if we look at the first condition, here we have the term document matrix compared to the original full text. And the original full text is in blue. So you see that the coherence distribution, has this sort of mountain-like shape. And it's centered around, this area 0.348 or something like that. And the coherence of the topics using the term document matrix is very distinct. The distributions are distinct, they hardly overlap, and it's considerably lower. So here we see that the term document matrix is not a useful format for topic modeling. But don't despair, because for the others, this is the same principle, 2 distributions, 2 topic coherence distributions, but now for the original in blue and the randomized text in orange. And you see that these 2 distributions, they overlap almost entirely. So there's no loss in coherence of the topics when you move from the original full text to the randomized word orders. And the reason is, of course, that topic modeling is based on a bag of words model anyways. And so as long as you have local coherence of the frequencies, there's not much difference in the topic coherence, or in the whole topic modeling process actually, that you obtain. And interestingly, the same happens also for these partial replacements of tokens by part of speech tags. As long as you have enough data, it doesn't matter if you have 20% less word forms at your disposal. The calculations can still run, and you basically obtain very, very similar distribution of coherence scores for your topic model. So that was really interesting and nice to see that that for some methods, some of these formats are actually almost equivalent. And the 2 formats, this randomized word order or partial replacement of tokens, especially the randomized word order, could have been shared with no problems, even if this was an in-copyright corpus. So this is really good news. Yes, and for other methods, this works as well. For stylometry, it works very well because it's also bag of words based. For contrastive analysis, which is something that I'm very interested in, it works fine as well, depending a little bit on the particular keenness measure you use. For sentiment analysis, it depends a lot on the method that you're using, whether that method is dependent on word order, for example, or not. But for example, for metaphor recognition, it doesn't work. These formats are just too reduced metaphor recognition is too difficult, too much dependent on exact phrasing in a local context, that if you lose some information, it just breaks down. But anyways, we can conclude here that certain derived text formats are great for topic modeling and also for some other methods. Others are much less useful. For example, the term document matrix is not useful for topic modeling, but this is still a very promising result and shows that that these derived text formats are not a bad idea, let's say. Now, let's move on to the second use case. Derived text formats for fine-tuning large language models. And now we come more to the large language model problem. And the example here is sentiment analysis. Now, the basic idea of or one pretty established way nowadays of using language models for research in digital humanities is this fine-tuning pipeline. Basically, you take a base model. Here, there's a llama, so it's an allusion to the llama family of models, but it could be any model that can be fine-tuned. They are trained on very basic, very general training objectives. And so they are general purpose models, trained on a lot of data, but not trained for any specific task. And so the idea of fine-tuning is that you fine-tune them, that you do an additional training step. You take the existing model and you do an additional training step with very specific data that is relevant to your task and for a specific task. For example, sentiment classification. Is a sentence, does it express a positive attitude or a neutral attitude or a negative attitude? For example, let's say movie reviews or something like that. And so we do this fine tuning, and then the idea is that we obtain a custom model that is specialized for this kind of material that you're interested in and for this particular task that you're interested in. And generally speaking, the assumption is that the performance of the custom model will be better for your particular task than if you just use the base model. Nowadays, with models getting better and better at a wider and wider range of tasks, this assumption is not always true anymore. But this is the basic strategy of fine tuning, and it's still an important model, of course. Now, this model supposes that you have at your disposal not only the data that you want to annotate with, let's say, sentiments, but also fine-tuning data. So relevant data that has already been annotated for sentiment that you can use for fine-tuning. And that's not always the case, of course. So the question is, if you have in copyright texts that you want to annotate with sentiment information, could you use a publicly available, suitably annotated derived text format corpus for fine-tuning? So does the fine-tuning work if the fine-tuning data is just derived text formats rather than full text? And the advantage of those being, of course, that we could produce them and make them available for others, even when the underlying data is in copyright. And then the question is, of course, what kinds of derived text format will be useful for this kind of fine-tuning? And this is what we did. This is relatively recent research that we presented at the Digital Humanities Conference 2024 in Washington. Now, the experimental design is pretty simple. So, well, we did a little bit more, but here I'm just focusing on part of it. So we used a corpus of German fairy tales. So they're rather short and they're rather dramatic. There's the wolf shows up, so everything's very scary, but then the kids are saved from the wolf and everybody's happy again. So we would expect, there to be some variation in sentiments in the sentences, okay? Then we take an existing BERT model, I forget which one, but it was a widely used BERT model, and fine-tune it for a sentiment classification task. But do this in several conditions again. So once with the full text and sentiment annotation, and this was a corpus that we reused that already had that sentiment annotation, and in using texts or versions, so derived text formats of those fairy tales that had this replacement of tokens, 0% to 100%. And so the question is, how well does the fine-tuning work for the sentiment classification if we use these different conditions, right? And then for each condition, we ran the whole pipeline 100 times and evaluated the accuracy every time. And that gives us the following results that you see here. So each box plot here is one condition and shows the distribution of the sentiment classification accuracy for that particular condition. So 100 accuracy values shown as a box plot. And you see the two extremes here. This one is if we don't make any replacement, the performance is about 0.57 or something. So it's not brilliant. It's not a very good score, especially given that we have 3 classes. So the baseline is 33, right? And if we look at the other extreme, if we remove all the words and just have part of speech, the performance goes down to 33, basically the baseline. So the performance is, in this case, in this condition, is basically random. There's no useful information in the data anymore, and the fine-tuning doesn't work well at all. But the interesting thing is that up to 40% of replacement of the word forms by the part of speech tag, the performance hardly suffers. And only afterwards, there's this, drop-off, sudden drop-off. It's a little bit unpredictable, so that's not such good news when it's so, at some point it just breaks down. That's probably task-dependent or corpus-dependent, so that's not very good news. But still, it's interesting that for such a long time, we still have good performance. So very encouraging in that sense, because 40% of word forms replaced by part of speech tokens, that is not fun to read anymore. So it basically becomes unreadable. So here we can conclude that specific DTFs are useful for fine-tuning, depending on the parameters and on a task. And so it does make sense to produce them and provide them publicly for others to use as as a service by an infrastructure such as the German National Research Data Infrastructure, for example. So in terms of our contribution to this National Research Data Infrastructure, it could make sense to produce these kinds of DTFs and publish them. One caveat here is that they are only useful if they have a relevant annotation. And this could be sentiment analysis, which is not easy to provide if you do manual annotation, and other annotations as well that people might be interested in. So it's not cheap or easy to produce these kinds of fine-tuning data sets. Anyways, let's come to the last use case. Can large language models reconstruct derived text formats? You have seen this randomization, you have seen the missing word forms, and large language models are basically designed, trained on masked text, for example. So text where the word form in one particular spot is missing. So we are assuming that they should actually be good at this task. And that would, of course, be a problem, right? If it's trivial to reconstruct the full text from a derived text format, then this text format is probably not considered safe from a copyright standpoint. You can argue who's responsible for reproduction. Is it the person who does the reconstruction, or is it the person who makes it easy for others to do the reconstruction? And that's actually open to debate. But still, if you make it too easy for people, you may still be in trouble for doing that. And so, given that what we know about large language models tells us that they actually should be pretty good at this, this might be a risk to this whole strategy of derived text format. So we need to do some empirical testing on this. And that's what we did in the paper that you see here, reconstructing shuffled text, which we presented at the recent conference on computational literary studies in Krakow. And the paper will hopefully come out in the next couple of weeks in the Journal of Computational Literary Studies. Now, what did we do here? First of all, we created derived text formats from full text, in this case, novels from Project Gutenberg. Again, public domain text so that we can openly share our experiments and our research data. But the same thing could be done within copyright texts as well. And then implement this reconstruction task basically as a machine translation task. It's like a sequence-to-sequence modeling problem, sequence-to-sequence problem, where we give the algorithm a sequence of tokens that have been randomized, and we say translate this to a different sequence of the same tokens that are the actual correct text, right? In this case, we used the T5 model and fine-tuned it with various DTFs and full text in order to see, how well the reconstruction will work. We had several conditions again. First, we varied the training set size, so a smaller set of just 12 novels and a bigger set of 60 novels to see whether the amount of training data makes a difference for the reconstruction quality. And we used 3 different segment length settings. So very short segments of 50 words, so where the words are scrambled or shuffled only in a very local context, 100, which is, medium, reasonable, and 500, which is pretty long. And then we used the fine-tuned model to reconstruct the full text from those derived text formats and evaluate, obviously, the quality of the reconstruction by comparing the reconstruction to the full text that we also have using some, standard scores like bleu and rouge scores. And a whole host you will see in a second. Now, this is just an example, a rather typical example of how this reconstruction looks like. So the source text, the original, is this snippet here that you see at the top. David, she cried, my dear David. Then she broke off. What is it? She asked in a different tone. He showed her the headlines of the newspaper he was carrying. Tragedy, he answered hoarsely. And then the reconstruction, one of the reconstructions, is what you see below. She cried, my dear David. He answered hoarsely. What is it? She asked. Then he broke off in a different tone. David. He showed her the headlines of the newspaper. Tragedy she was carrying. So, sort of, you see that it's the same words rearranged, and it sort of, it makes some limited sense, right? There is some overlap, like he showed her the headlines of the newspaper. I think it's the longest stretch of correctly reconstructed text, but it doesn't make any sense overall, right? The interaction is different, and the context obviously cannot be taken into account. So, it's good. I mean, it's interesting, but it's certainly not a reconstruction of the original text that would, replace the original. But some of them are better, some of them are much worse, actually. But so let's look at the quantitative evaluation. So here you see the different conditions, right? At the top, the smaller corpus size, and at the bottom, the bigger corpus size. And one thing that is immediately striking is, of course, that with the small training data, the small training set, the quality is really bad. Whatever condition, it's really low and not useful. But of course, that's a small data set. That's a small training data set. So, we should look at the condition with more training data as well. And here you see that one score is pretty good for the smaller chunks, the Rouge 1 score. But that's a score that only looks at, the frequency of the tokens that are involved and doesn't capture the sequence information at all. So no wonder this one is good, because it doesn't actually look at the, is it the correct sequence? The other scores do look at that, and they are pretty low. So again, they're pretty low, and they're even lower, and even the Rouge 1 score is low when the chunk size is, 500. So this shows us that, first of all, this is a difficult task, even for, modern fine-tuned language model. And that if we, even with a decent amount of training data, if the chunk length, if this parameter is set to 500, the reconstruction basically fails. So this is what we called bad news for natural language processing, but good news for digital humanities, right? Because the reconstruction failed. Of course, you could say, okay, yeah, bad results for NLP, but good news for DH. That's basically the bottom line of this research. Now, there are some caveats to this. One is that we would expect a certain link between the reconstruction performance on the one hand and the memorization effect on the other hand. So any novel that is part of the training data of a given large language model would probably have a better chance of being reconstructed correctly than completely unknown texts. So, if OpenAI or Anthropic or Meta already breached the copyright restrictions in training the data, then this would probably help reconstruct it here and endanger our own derived text format legality. So that's a complicated situation. And of course, the future improvement in performance is very likely. So just because we couldn't do it this time doesn't mean that other smarter people or other people, smarter people in a year or two or in 5 years couldn't do it. So it means that it's not trivial at the moment. I mean, this was a team, and we worked for a couple of months using using some hardware that not everybody has at home. So, not trivial, but also not impossible. And in the future, it is very likely to get easier. Now, let's conclude this run through these use cases with a few observations. So, on the level of copyright and AI or LLMs, I think we can observe that copyright, the purpose of copyright is to foster and support creative writing. And we really have to ask whether this is still what it does today, or whether it does that sufficiently today with the basically AI replacing a lot of creative workers, or aiming to replace them at least. And certainly copyright hasn't protected writers and creatives in general from generative AI. They're under threat everywhere. And copyright is clearly an obstacle for DH research, because we are limited in the materials we can work with, the materials that we can reuse, in our transparency, reproducibility, sustainability of our research is hindered by copyright. So what do we need? One thing is, I think we need more legal clarity on what is legal, what is not legal. And especially, DTFs are still unexplored territory. So universities are really risk averse. If you ask the legal department, is it okay if I publish this in copyright material as a DTF, they will probably tell you, not to do it. Even though, our research, for example, shows that it's perfectly fine, or it should be fine. The thing is, who's to tell? And so the other thing I think we need is maybe a new balance in copyright law that gives more leeway to research, something like fair use for research, without necessarily giving the same kind of leeway to commercial entities. And then in terms of derived text formats, I think that what I have been able to show that this is really one useful way of, in a way, circumventing copyright, right? Because we take out the copyright relevant features and can still do something with them. Because for some research methods, they are viable and useful materials. They can increase reproducibility and sustainability, because if you publish computational work on in-copyright materials, you cannot publish the materials that you worked on, so nobody can check what you did. But you can publish the DTFs, and a lot of what you did can still be, revised and inspected by others. And of course, others can reuse those materials. And of course, DTFs have their limitations. Not every kind of research is possible with any kind of DTF. And we don't know what happens in the future, whether they will be easy to reconstruct reliably in the future. So again, what we need here as well is a greater clarity on what can and cannot be done with DTFs, which basically means I think we should be doing more research into this approach to in-copyright materials for digital humanities. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you so much, Christof, for that really fascinating and tremendously rich and detailed presentation. I'm sure many of our undergraduates, even if they haven't taken many courses in DH, will be familiar with some of those, sort of page level DTFs from maybe even Google Books. I think they have something basically similar for their copyright material, as well as Hathi Trust. So it's nice to see that connected to a larger story. So we have about 15 minutes, I think, for questions, and indeed the questions are starting to come in.
Yeah.
I see that they should be in the chat. I think. Can you see them, Christof?
Yeah, I can see them, and I can just take them, read them out, and try to address them, right? So the first
Sure.
one is the datasets derived from these methods, since they are only data not created by EU law, are these derived text corpora therefore public domain? And yes, that's the basic idea. They are not covered or protected by copyright anymore, and so their reproduction, their publication dissemination is not limited by copyright law. So they live outside of copyright law. Whether you could say they're public domain, I'm a little bit unsure about the terminology, but they are not protected by copyright law, and they can be shared freely. They can be distributed. They can be reused. They can be reproduced, copied at will. That's the whole idea. Yes, yes. So the second one is about different countries having different laws, and yes, so that's a huge problem, of course, that because we don't work, we don't publish our data, in one particular country. We put it online, and so it's available to anybody, and that creates a huge uncertainty for anything you might want to do in terms of publication. And the situation here is really complicated because basically so it doesn't just depend on where the server is, right? So you could say, hey, my server is in Ireland, so Irish law applies. But actually it's not that easy, because if you, for example, publish materials in let's say in French, so you're basically targeting an audience that can handle these materials. So an audience in France, Canada, parts of Africa, and then they are considered your target group, and you have to comply with the laws that apply to those target groups, and that makes things tremendously complicated. And this is, for example, the reason why you can access platforms that publish books in Canada, because they have different copyright law, a little bit less restrictive than in Europe, but you're actually technically not allowed to download some of their materials if you are doing that from Europe. So yes, the international level of the internet makes things tremendously complicated. Yeah. Huh. For students who want to use digital tools to analyze text, what is the single most important piece of advice you would give us regarding copyright law? Well, so one advice would be, don't let yourself be limited too much, because, there are gray zones. As long as you don't make massive amounts of copyrighted data, or even any copyrighted data, available to others freely on the internet, you're unlikely to be in trouble, right? It doesn't mean it's legal, and I don't want to give that kind of advice telling you you can do anything as long as you don't publish the stuff. As I said in the presentation, the author has the right to control the reproduction, any reproduction, unless there's an exception that grants you the right to do so. So it's not legal, but you really get into trouble as soon as you make things available publicly to others, and if you impinge on commercial interests of others. So the whole music industry upheavals 15 years ago, that was because people were suddenly openly sharing MP3s, and basically the income was drying up, and that led to a lot of changes. Yeah. There's one about AI-generated content. Should AI-generated content receive copyright protection? And if so, who should hold the rights? The user who commands the AI, the company that built it, or the AI itself? Yeah, that's a much debated question. So the way that copyright law is set up, at least in the US and in Europe, is that a machine cannot hold the copyright. So the AI itself cannot hold the copyright. Whether or not the user or basically the company or the programmers hold the copyright, that's a matter of debate, and in my opinion depends a lot on how the creative process was done. So if a considerable amount of expertise, time, effort went into the prompting, and a considerable part of what the output is actually determined by the prompting, then you could claim that you basically just use the AI as a tool to help you, but you are the one in charge, and that you should own the copyright. But if you just say, write me a story and then you get the story, then there's no reason why you should have the copyright to it. And in that case, honestly, I don't know whether anybody holds the copyright to it. Yeah, there's so many questions. Let's go to the next one by Lengho Wang. If someone used open write sources for DTFs, so if the source text that you use to create DTFs are not in copyright, then there's actually no need to use DTFs, right? Then you can just use the full text. And so, of course, the full text is always better than the DTF because any DTF will have a loss of information of some kind. So the best way, of course, is to use the full text if you can. So for anything that is in the public domain, I would never recommend using DTFs. We do that basically for experimental purposes. So in order to investigate DTF itself as a concept, as a mechanism, it makes sense to do that on public domain corpora, because then we can share our data. We cannot be in trouble if we use a DTF that turns out to be problematic from the standpoint of copyright. But for any real use case, I would only use DTFs for in copyright materials. And I would also say I would be very careful in what kinds of DTFs I publish. I would not publish DTFs that I consider to be, borderline problematic in terms of easy reconstructibility, easy readability. So rather, long segments of randomization, for example, or high proportion of replaced tokens in order to be on the safe side. But this is precisely where the research is necessary. What can we do safely? And we need guidelines and legal decisions on these particular cases. And this is it's not a new idea, but it's an idea that has only started to gain traction. So there are no big cases on this. So we don't know a lot about this. Yeah. What is the role of AI in enhancing copyright? Well, I think that's a question that you can take at two levels. Like technically, does AI, theoretically, people who are, thinking about copyright law and thinking about changes in copyright law, they could be using AI to help them in a way. That would be one level. The other thing I think is much more relevant is, how is the fact that we see AI companies not respect copyright law or, run against copyright law, how is that affecting thinking about policy, in countries in the EU, in the US, elsewhere, to maybe change their copyright laws? So here, that could, in that sense, AI could have a huge impact. And we've seen, recently, just a few weeks ago, the Sora 2 debacle. Sora 2 was launched and had to be immediately constrained because too many, copyright infringements were produced by this video generating system. So I'm sure that policymakers are under huge pressure from AI companies to, give them more leeway. And of course, content creators, if you think of screenwriters in Hollywood, they of course are lobbying against that. So there's going to be a lot of debate on this because of AI. And I'm sure copyright will change because of that. In 5 years, things may be very different from what they are now. So,
Hi, Christof. I can ask if you want.
Yeah, sure.
Mine is next here.
Okay.
Thanks for the talk. It's hugely relevant. I am constructing a corpus of in-copyright materials here in Hong Kong using, UGC funding. And I have had to make many, many promises about the levels of security that I will use to keep this data in order to satisfy what seems to be a pretty unsettled legal situation in Hong Kong about this. So it really could make a big difference to me. And as you see, I am curious here about these DRM-free copies you have managed to obtain from EU publishers. If it only takes me an email, I can send hundreds of emails to publishers. Could you tell me a little more about obtaining these DRM-free copies? Because I would love to have a cleaner legal
Yeah.
background to the work that I am doing.
Yeah. So the way this works, basically, so the way we did this is we relied on one particular paragraph in the copyright law that stipulates this right to obtain a DRM-free copy, and that's in German copyright law because we are in Germany. So it doesn't depend on where the publisher sits. We also solicited MIT Press for this, for example, and they complied because we are part of their, like Germany is part of their market, and they have to comply with German laws for German customers. And the way this was actually set up was quite interesting. I partnered for this with a foundation and a lawyer, so we were ready for anything. Basically, we were ready for strategic. How do you say that? A strategic lawsuit, basically. We were hoping for someone not to comply, basically, so that we could sue them and make an example out of it. But they all complied. And it was easy. Yes, the lawyer set up a letter, with all the legalese, and we sent that out, and they basically complied more or less quickly. Some of them obviously had to think about it or consult with the legal department, but they complied. So I think it would scale if you buy a lot of books from the same publisher, because then you can just say, here are my 200 books that I bought. Please give me the 200 free copies, right? If you have to hunt down all the publishers, yeah, sure, you can send hundreds of emails, but first you have to find the addresses, find the right person to talk to. It does involve a bit of work. Now, the problem, I think, is mainly that you are not in a jurisdiction where you can rely on that paragraph, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and if someone does it for you in Europe, they would be allowed to, to obtain the copy for their own research, but they wouldn't be allowed to share it with you unless you have like a joint project. So basically, you would need to set up a joint project with someone in Europe.
This has already occurred to me. Like you said, project members. Now,
Yeah.
anybody can be a member of a project, right?
Yes.
But okay, this is very helpful.
I mean, you would somehow show, I suppose you would have to somehow show that you are actually having a project together, but
Yeah.
I mean, that's not complicated. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. It's very helpful to hear a little more about how that happened.
Sure. Sure. And we can, anytime we can talk.
Thank you.
Great. Great. Yeah, so it's reached 5:30 here in Hong Kong. So and unfortunately we have to call it a day, but it's been a tremendous discussion, and some real practical applications in people's research, which is I guess one of the aims of the seminar series. So that's great. Thank you everyone for your questions and for taking the time to attend the seminar. Just to let you know, the next meeting will be on the 21st of October when we'll be hearing from Erin McCarthy, who's going to be talking to us on the topic of early modern computational literary studies. So we look forward to that. And of course, we have to thank our speaker again for such a great presentation. It's really great to see the truly valuable work that you and your collaborators are doing. And I hope we can welcome you to Hong Kong again in the near future. So
sure, that would be great. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for all the good questions. It was a pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks so much, Christof. Okay, goodbye, everyone.
Yeah, bye-bye. Thanks a lot for setting this up.